And welcome to another breakdown. Today we're going to be taking on the most challenging series I've done yet with The Lord of the Rings. That's saying something, having already tackled both Malazan and Wheel of Time, but when it comes to getting into the legacy and publication of a series, there is maybe none with more to talk about than The Lord of the Rings. And I'm going to be talking about so many different elements to this series, but without getting into spoilers or story specifics. For those of you unaware, the breakdown is more about the metatextual elements around a story rather than the story or series itself. So let's go ahead and kick that off by talking about the man himself, J.R.R. Tolkien. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was born the 3rd of January, 1892, in what is now the Free State Province of the Republic of South Africa. When he was just 3 years old, Tolkien's mother took him and his brother back to England for what was supposed to be an extended family trip. However, his father unfortunately did pass away back in South Africa of the rheumatic fever before he could join them. This left the family without an income, so Tolkien's mother took the family to live with her parents in Birmingham. Now, this is the area of the English countryside where Tolkien grew up, and he has spoken at length in several different interviews about how the beauty of this landscape influenced his creation of Middle-earth, and having been to the UK a couple times myself, I can understand why. Y'all's country is beautiful. But even at this young age, Tolkien was showing an inkling for the creative and imaginative and language-based side of his later career, collaborating with his cousin Mary to invent a language called Nevbosh? But the first big step in Tolkien's academic career comes in 1913, when he was accepted to and started attending Oxford University, at first studying the classics, but soon shifting his focus to the English language. Tolkien's academic career seemed to be on a smooth trajectory until the Great War, aka World War I, broke out in 1914. Now, most fans do know that Tolkien did fight in the First World War, but he actually did not join as quickly as most young men were at the time, and even faced backlash for what was considered cowardice for not doing so, even from his own relatives. Instead, Tolkien joined a specific program that allowed him to finish his degree before he was enlisted as a lieutenant. In a letter to his son Michael reflecting on the time, Tolkien said, "In those days, chaps joined up, or were scorned publicly. It was a nasty cleft to be in for a young man with too much imagination and little physical courage." Now, I am not pointing this out to bash Tolkien in any way, shape, or form. War is hell, and I personally probably would have done exactly the same thing if I could at the time. But as I said before, after finishing his finals, Tolkien was commissioned as a second lieutenant, specifically in the line infantry regiment called the Lancaster Fusiliers, where after training with the 13th Reserve Battalion, he was ordered to head to France. The night before his departure, Tolkien wrote, "Junior officers were being killed off, a dozen a minute. Parting from my wife then, it was like death." Now, oversimplifying Tolkien's wider service from here, he did see combat, most notably in the Battle of Somme. There were many smaller events during this battle that Tolkien notably was involved with, including the capture of Leipzig's Salient and the capture of Regina Trench, where he was wounded in action. Now, not only am I not qualified to talk in detail about the experiences of soldiers in World War I, but it's not going to match the tone of the rest of this video for me to go in deeper than here, so we're going to gloss over a lot of information and talk about what happened to Tolkien after the war. Because on the 3rd of November of 1920, Tolkien left the military officially and for good, and his academic career from here went into high gear. Appropriately, Tolkien's first civilian job after his military service was for the Oxford English Dictionary, where he worked mainly on the history and etymology of words of Germanic origin and beginning with the letter W. What wonderfully whimsical work which provided wages for Vulcan. Tolkien became a reader, which is apparently a job title I was not aware of the English language over at the University of Leeds, becoming the youngest member of the academic staff there. While there, he produced a Middle English vocabulary and a definitive edition of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. In 1925, he returned to Oxford as a professor of Anglo-Saxon, with a fellowship at Pembroke College. During his time at Pembroke College, Tolkien wrote The Hobbit and the first 2 volumes of The Lord of the Rings. But wait! We have more academic stuff to talk about before we get into that. Hold your horses! Don't worry, I'm not going to spend too much more time here, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that Tolkien pretty much changed the way Beowulf is talked about in the modern zeitgeist with the work he did on that story with his time as a professor. And I will say, if you want to see the strength of Tolkien as a scholar and rhetorician, check out his essay on fairy stories. It's a brilliant work of him disagreeing with a few of his peers and their views in the development of such stories, and I thought it was a wonderful time capsule, the views of the time, and how Tolkien was, in my opinion, absolutely right. The guy had his hand on the pulse of fairy tales of the time and their deep connection to culture, and I think if you read between the lines here a little bit, you can see how he was going to change things in the future with his very accurate view of how things came to be where they are with the state of fairy tales, aka fantasy. And one final fun note about Tolkien's academic career, him and C.S. Lewis were friends, and both a part of an informal literary group called the Inklings. And I just think this is a very clear example of a fun tradition that has long been a part of fantasy authors up into this time. This goes back before Tolkien with like how Mary Shelley was challenged to come up with Frankenstein, and we're seeing it still today with Sanderson running a podcast with Dan Wells. Authors like to collaborate, share their ideas, and challenge one another. In today's day and age, they get to do it publicly. I think that's neat, and I'd like to think that C.S. Lewis and Tolkien would like to have a podcast if they were around today. I'm a nerd. And on this episode of Tolk Talk, I think we should get into what you said last week about allegory. Oh, come on, I don't want to hear Lewis. I don't Okay, I know, I hear you. You're done hearing about the man, and you want to hear about the books. Let's get into the publication, The Lord of the Rings, and The Hobbit, and The Silmarillion. But not anything after that. That's another video for another time. But keeping with a long tradition of fantasy books, Tolkien actually had some delays when putting out his Middle-earth series. But not with The Hobbit, which was the first Middle-earth book published in the 21st of September, 1937. By Allen and Unwin. The first print run of 1,500 copies sold out very quickly due to positive word of mouth and some overwhelmingly positive reviews from publications. One specific review from fellow writer C.S. Lewis I find to be really endearing, and it said, "The truth is that in this book, a number of good things, never before united, have come together. A fund of humor, an understanding of children, and a happy fusion of the scholars with the poet's grasp of mythology." And while these two legendary authors are talked about as frenemies, which is a myth I've bought into myself before, it's important to remember that in all real accounts of the two's interactions, they were just longtime friends who like to give each other crap. But if you've read the Middle-earth books, you could probably already call why The Hobbit would be the easiest to release. That being said though, it did still have some publication issues, mainly due to the fact there was a paper shortage going on due to rationing of supplies during, you guessed it, World War II. But Tolkien was flat out asked for a sequel, to which he responded with early versions of the Silmarillion. And if you're a publisher and someone just put out The Hobbit and then they bring you the Silmarillion, there could be some issues there. Essentially, his publisher said, "Nah man, people want more hobbits. Give us Hobbit, not a world history." So Tolkien began working on The Lord of the Ring, or as he first called it, The New Hobbit. Now an important note to keep in mind about the original publication of The Hobbit versus many of the editions that have been released since then. Tolkien did change the story after the book's first release to better align with the story he told in The Lord of the Rings. That's a whole other video for another day, but just know there are technically inconsistencies between the versions of The Hobbit. Now, a brief side note I would like to take about The Hobbit that I found absolutely fascinating is how the perception of this story changed after the release of the Lord of the Rings books, because The Hobbit was originally published as a standalone material. Now it's often talked about as if it's just a prelude to the Lord of the Rings, but I don't think that's entirely fair. The Hobbit stands on its own as an absolute masterpiece, and is, in my opinion, Tolkien's actually most digestible and impressive writing. I think The Lord of the Rings is a bit more purple in some ways and definitely has some more intense world building elements, but in terms of the raw narrative value you get from The Hobbit, I find it to be like a perfect 10 out of 10, and I do occasionally come across people who have read Lord of the Rings but not bothered with The Hobbit. Read the fucking Hobbit. Anyway, but now is where the publication issues really begin. And I think this comes down to a miscommunication of perception of what Middle-earth is between Tolkien and his publisher. Tolkien already viewed this world as if he'd already put out all the books, and he just needed to get the rest of the material out there for other people to view it as he did, or most of us do now. But for his publisher Allen and Unwin, suddenly he was bringing these world history texts and this massive single volume of The Lord of the Rings that he wanted to put out as an individual individual book. So they said no to his initial pitches for what would come next, and because of that, Tolkien actually went behind his publisher's back and met with William Collins. This did not go as Tolkien wanted it to. He thought he'd be able to come to the table and make some demands to get The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion published exactly as he wanted them. But even William Collins told him no and wanted to cut down specifically The Lord of the Rings a lot while showing pretty much no interest in the Silmarillion. So at this point, fearing the rest of his works might just never be published, Tolkien went back to Allen and Unwin and agreed to have The Lord of the Rings published as 3 separate books. But still the story he wanted to tell, which I think was more important to him in the long run, and I agree with, especially because you can just buy The Lord of the Rings as 1 volume now in pretty much every bookstore on the planet. Now those delays I talked about before that happened with Lord of the Rings, not The Hobbit, I think are actually a sign of Allen and Unwin kind of meeting Tolkien in the middle, because apparently they gave him additional time to work on appendices and maps to be included in the first publication of Lord of the Rings, which they were. But putting the disruptions of war and publisher backtalk and scheming aside, finally in July 29th of 1954, the Fellowship of the Ring was released to overwhelmingly mixed reviews, actually. A lot of people claim online that all Middle-earth books were overwhelmingly praised upon their release, and while I did find that to be true in my research for The Hobbit, there was some negative reception to each of the 3 Lord of the Rings books upon their release as well. Obviously, with the hindsight of time, those have not aged great, but I have a few examples. Of the positive you can look at, the Sunday Telegraph saying, among the greatest works of imaginative fiction of the 21st century in regards to Fellowship of the Ring. Nebula Science Fiction said, if you don't read it, you have missed one of the finest books of its type ever to appear. But also we got from specifically literary critics things like, from Edwin Muir, all the characters are boys masquerading as adult heroes and will never come to puberty. Hardly one of them knows anything about women. Which I find extra funny because apparently this upset Tolkien enough to go to complain to his publisher, and I love to imagine Tolkien complaining to his publisher, to which the publisher's like, do you want us to kill him? And from a respected literary critic this time, Edward Wilson, we have the quote, Dr. Tolkien has a little skill at narrative and no instinct for literary form. Talk about reviews that have not aged well. But finishing off the trilogy, The Two Towers was released in the 11th of November of 1954, and Return of the King, October 20th of 1955. An important note for people who haven't actually gone in to read the books, each book has 2 books within them. For example, Fellowship of the Ring is composed of The Ring Sets Out and The Ring Goes South. The Two Towers is composed of The Treason of Isengard, which, spoilers, my guy, and The Ring Goes East. And The Return of the King has The War of the Ring and The End of the Third Age. From here I want to talk about the reception to Tolkien's work over the years and how his impact on the fantasy genre is simultaneously both over and understated, because this is a more delicate conversation than it often gets treated with. Don't get me wrong, what Tolkien did essentially was impactful and revolutionary enough to cause the entire publishing industry to have to do a 180 with the amount of people he inspired and just invent a genre, science fiction and fantasy, to kind of encapsulate what he was putting out and the impact he made. Notice I said sci-fi and fantasy. That's because those 2 genres used to be very interconnected and were divorced later on. That's time for another video. But Tolkien had his influences as well. And I've seen some people make claims like that he invented the concept of a goblin, which he did not. He absolutely invented several other fantasy creatures that have just become synonymous with the genre as a whole. There's a reason in Middle-earth they're hobbits, and in D&D they're halflings. He made that. But it's important to remember that Tolkien isn't some prophet who was able to just invent something from nothing. He was inspired as well. And it's important to remember where those roots came from, like his work that he put in with Beowulf, which you can clearly see inspiring some of the elements he was telling in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. The reason I'm saying all of this is sometimes you will see people online almost dismiss other cultures that had their own fantasy revolution at various times, some of which themselves were absolutely inspired by Tolkien, but others to a lesser extent. It's just a far more nuanced topic than just Tolkien invented fantasy. He kinda did, and I think when almost anyone in the modern genre says they're standing on the shoulders of giants with what they're writing now, the giant that they're standing on is standing on another giant, and that's Tolkien. But it's not the most just black and white before and after. There is, of course, some gray. But alright, getting that nitty-gritty subjective conversation out of the way, which we'll never get all the answers for too, let's go ahead and talk about the adaptations, which I thought would be a fairly small and straightforward part of this video. It's by far the biggest. Oh god. Now, with the commercial and critical success of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, adaptations were inevitable. Famously, the Tolkien estate has been extremely guarded in who they let adapt the franchise in terms of live-action adaptations. Of course, there are some unlicensed ones in existence we will touch on, but unless you're willing to hand the estate an Amazon forest-sized pile of cash, it seems less and less likely these days that you're going to get the rights for future adaptations. Even Rings of Power had to pay a literal pile of fortunes to gain the rights for a slim sliver of Tolkien's world. Now, in terms of animated or video game adaptations for Middle-earth, it seems to be a bit easier to get done, but some of that can be chalked up to the fact that the Tolkien estate does not hold all of the rights they would like to due to decisions made early on in the franchise's development that we will get to. Now, recently, this company has acquired a whole lot of the rights that I bet Amazon wishes they had, and the future of Lord of the Rings franchise is largely in their hands, and we'll see what they do. But before we start talking about the future, let's travel way back to the past. And I'm excited to say the first adaptations for Lord of the Rings we're going to be talking about are actually going to be the failed attempts. Yes, just as important in my opinion to the legacy of any fantasy franchise is not only what was done, but was attempted to be done, and why didn't it work? There's a big elephant in the room to address when talking about early attempts to adapting The Lord of the Rings, and that elephant's name is Disney. From as early as 1938, Disney has had several members of its creative team suggest adapting Tolkien's work, including possibly working elements of it into Fantasia. None of this has ever worked out, and Disney has never gone far enough to own any of Middle-earth's rights. This eventually led to false rumors that Disney held some rights to this world and that it became some point of contention between them and United Artists, a group that did hold rights to Middle-earth far later on. This is not true, but Disney's last even coming close to moving towards an attempt to adapting Tolkien's Middle-earth came in 1972, when Vance Gary looked into but decided against it, stating Disney had never done a cartoon with this much story, admitting that there are far more incidents in the story than they could ever use, and many sections were far too frightening for the Disney brand. And of note, this was always entirely one-sided. Tolkien did not like Disney and wouldn't have sold to them regardless. There was apparently one instance of a secretary of Tolkien's making contact with Disney, and this rumor, which is not verified, claims she was making this offer to drive up a price while Tolkien was talking to another studio about possibly selling rights. That's as far as it ever went, and I find it kind of funny that Disney's just kind of been playing in the corner like, could we do something with Middle-earth? And Tolkien's just in the other corner like, no. But this takes me to the first ever individual to reach out to Tolkien about a possible adaptation that did not work out, and this happened in 1956. Animator Al Broddux reached out to Tolkien in 1956, and apparently Tolkien did like his work, but nothing came of this. And I tried to find more on this, but I have to include it because it's there, but that's pretty much all that's known. But also in 1956, apparently Forrest J. Ackerman worked with Tolkien on a couple different versions of possibly adapting Lord of the Rings, both animated and live action. What happened here is so painfully cliche, it's almost like you went to one of those AI like writing softwares and just asked it to spit out some kind of story about a failed attempt to get something adapted. Apparently, scripts were attempted, studios said no, Tolkien's story was cut down way too much and he started not liking the idea. All of this accumulated in Tolkien still wanting to move forward, but Ackerman ran out of money and the entire endeavor, which apparently was being talked about quite a bit in Hollywood at the time, started being criticized by industry bigwigs as never being serious. And this all seemed to repeat itself again in 1959, when Robert Gutwilling tried very similar endeavor that never went far with Tolkien. Despite the two apparently getting along and respecting each other's visions, this just goes to show that something as big as this can have people getting along, wanting to do it, even the money, but if you aren't able to keep the momentum going, so many projects like this just end up dying. Even today, getting a big adaptation greenlit is a Herculean task. back then, when there weren't these set, tried and true ways to get it done and examples of it succeeding, I understand why we see multiple failed attempts before anything successful is accomplished. But the first big controversy comes in 1961. Rembrandt Films, an Oscar-winning company, got the rights to adapt The Hobbit, and just The Hobbit, for 5 years. But due to a publication mishap, it was realized that The Hobbit was, and still is to this day, of course, in the public domain in the United States, and just the United States.
The stupid, foolish human has made a mistake. No, The Hobbit is not still in public domain, and this bit of information was presented improperly. The truth of the story is more complex. In 1954, the first Lord of the Rings books was published in the United States with a mere 1,500 copies. Desperate to meet the demand, the American publisher, Houghton Mifflin, simply imported UK-printed copies of the book instead of printing more within the United States. A US copyright law at the time contained a protectionist manufacturing requirement for books, requiring books sold in the United States be printed in the United States, with only limited exceptions. This is what allowed Ace Books to print over 150,000 copies of The Lord of the Rings in 1965. Tolkien was unable to sue due to this issue with his copyright, but he did notify his fans, and grassroots pressure from the fans became so great that Ace Books withdrew their edition and actually ended up paying Tolkien some of the money they owed him. But once the Supreme Court decided the case, Golan v. Holder, many public domain properties that had entered the public domain through strange happenstance were restored to their original rights owners. This included the Lord of the Rings writings that Tolkien had lost to American and American-only public domain. Back to the stupid human.
But because of this, they were able to renegotiate the deal, and Tolkien and his publishing company were only given $15,000 in that time's money for the rights. Now, this quickly went downhill from an already bad start. What was supposed to originally be a feature-length cartoon that took insulting liberties with Tolkien's story was trimmed down and premiered as a 12-minute short. It was shown once to a small crowd of people pulled from the street of New York in a projection room. Good God! And was only done so that they could claim that a animated feature color film of Hobbit had been accomplished, which was part of the contract. But that does mean, forever, the first time any true adaptation of Tolkien's material was aired, it was to 12 people in a projection room as a middle finger to the author. If that doesn't speak on the legacy of adaptations to come for fantasy as a whole, I don't know what does. But there are some good ones, and we'll get to those. Now, two men, William Snyder and Gene Deitch, are largely responsible for this. And you know, screw those guys. Deitch claimed they also had the rights to Lord of the Rings, which was obviously and easily disputed and resulted in Tolkien selling the rights to the United Artists in 1969 with an option for The Hobbit for $1.5 million adjusted for inflation and 7.5% of the gross minus expensive being paid directly to Tolkien. Now, after all these contracts were done, a plan to adapt The Lord of the Rings into a single feature film was planned. Now, I know what you're thinking. All of Lord of the Rings, one film. Why? Well, sequels weren't really an established thing for fantasy movies at this time. I mean, you have to remember, Hollywood is still kind of getting on its feet and becoming the gargantuan industry it is today, and yeah, something like Lord of the Rings being adapted and committing to 3 films wasn't really a standard. But we are still in the failed adaptations section, and nothing really came of the scripts that were developed. But the most important part of this is eventually United Artists actually were able to buy the rights in perpetuity with an option to be able to sell them to other studios. And from here, of course, we're gonna talk about the Beatles. Yes, really, they're involved. The Beatles were in a 3-film deal with United Artists, and they had already completed 2 of those movies. And someone floated the idea of making a musical adaptation of The Lord of the Rings that would have the members of the Beatles cast as parts of the Fellowship. And my favorite little detail is apparently someone thought this was a good enough idea to bring it to Stanley Kubrick to which he very intelligently said no. This was allowed to percolate amongst this group for long enough that eventually I think enough people just realized how catastrophically bad of an idea this was. Hey, you know, the Beatles aren't exactly actors. Don't worry, Beatles fans, I know the Beatles were in multiple movies. They are technically actors, just not good ones. And the whole thing was just allowed to fade into the nothing. But our final failed attempt comes in 1972, with the introduction of the man John Boorman. And a lot of this will sound familiar. One single 3-hour film, the book was changed a lot, bad calls were made, and it fell apart after several attempts due to financial concerns. Man, I'm glad that was the last one, because it really started to sound like a broken record. The Beatles were a nice change-up, though. And from here, we're going to talk about the successful adaptations, starting specifically with the animated legacy of Lord of the Rings, because in 1977, Rankin and Bass released the Hobbit TV special we all have probably seen. Intelligently, Rankin knew a single film could not possibly capture all of Lord of the Rings, so instead he just aimed for The Hobbit. Production cost around $2 million, and I think that intelligent choice of just doing The Hobbit for this budget is why this isn't awful. But it is important to note, this was released without Tolkien's consent because The Hobbit was in the United States public domain. And I am usually pro public domain, but not when it's due to a clerical error. That kinda sucks. Though, fun fact, the same thing happened in Night of the Living Dead, and it's why that was so quickly used in the background of like so many other horror movies as a reference. That also just entered the public domain because someone f***ed up. And then we have the 1978 Lord of the Rings, which deserves its own deep dive. There's a lot to unpack here, but boiling this one down, Ralph Bakshi's The Lord of the Rings was actually planned to be multiple films, but that was reduced to just one before being brought up to 2. Only part 1 ever got made and was released to yet again mixed reviews. Those who have seen the plans for the second, including Peter Jackson himself, has claimed it was a borderline incomprehensible mess, and so for that reason I'm very glad it was never made. Now in 1980, Rankin and Bass, they returned to the picture and actually did manage to get an adaptation of The Return of the King done called The Return of the King, A Story of Hobbits. But tainting the legacy of this adaptation more than just already being something that shouldn't exist in the first place, there was a failed lawsuit to stop it from being released, and on top of that, both of these men have come forward and said they regretted making it. And a big shout out to Nerd of the Rings, probably my favorite Lord of the Rings dedicated YouTube channel here on the platform, because I sent the creator over there an early draft of this video, and they pointed out that I forgot to mention the 1981 BBC radio drama adaptation of The Lord of the Rings that aired from March 8th of 1981 to August 30th. I love this radio drama. I just spent a few hours going through a good portion of it, and you bet your butt I'm gonna finish it. This is a really fun adaptation that actually includes some stuff from Tolkien that wasn't in the original books that is in more of the expanded tales. Old radio dramas used to be what I fall asleep to, so the fact that there's this 1981 Lord of the Rings radio drama means that's what I'm gonna be falling to sleep to for the next few nights. Again, big shout out to Nerd of the Rings. If you're a Lord of the Rings fan, I highly recommend you check out for helping me go over a lot of my research and double fact check this video. Back to the rest of it. Oh, that was a lot. Okay, we're done. No live action? No, right, there's the live action side of things. Let's get into it. Now, to be perfectly honest with you, quite a bit of live action Middle-earth content exists out there, from fan-made stuff on YouTube to just stuff that was broadcast and lost to time forever. So I can't really cover them all, but what we will do is talk about the important and interesting ones, specifically starting with one that we thought was lost. Recently uploaded to YouTube in 1985, there was a Soviet Union adaptation of The Fellowship of the Ring and The Hobbit. I do genuinely recommend you put these on with some friends and crack some drinks, because they are recognizably the stories of The Hobbit and The Fellowship of the Ring. And that's what I'll say on that, and they're interesting. The Hobbit's adaptation is titled The Fabulous Journey of Mr. Bilbo Baggins the Hobbit, and the Soviet Fellowship of the Ring adaptation is titled Keepers of the Rings. I like the Fabulous Journey title. I don't know why Keepers was added. Like, they're trying to destroy it. They're not trying to, like, they're trying to, they want to, that's not keeping. Why shouldn't I keep it? And one I'm including just because I find it a little bit frustrating and I want to put that in your head as well. There was also a Finnish adaptation in 1993 titled The Hobbit, which did not tell the story of The Hobbit and instead told the story of the Fellowship of the Ring. It was from the perspective of the hobbits, apparently, and that's why they titled it that. That's a very dumb justification, and that's a dumb name. But okay. Let's talk about Peter Jackson. A series of films some consider the strongest film trilogy of all time, still holding a tied record for the film with the most number of Oscars, largely for technical marvels that were managed to be achieved in this adaptation. The Peter Jackson trilogy is the best adaptation we'll ever get of Lord of the Rings. I cannot see into the future. Possibly I will be proven wrong. I don't think I will. Oh, and it's tied with Ben-Hur and Titanic, and those were both technically nominated for more Oscars, but Return of the King won every single Oscar it was nominated for, which I think is more impressive. It's batting 100% at the Oscars. Don't get me wrong, the Oscars are a total sham that people like pay to win, but still, that's impressive. Now, to me, the big difference of how these films came together to be this good is Peter Jackson spent an unusual amount of time in pre- and post-production, visualizing the hell out of how he wanted to tell the story of the Lord of the Rings. And he did not try to condense it down to one 3-hour movie, and instead, kinda made 3 3-hour movies. Extended edition's best edition, we all know it's true. It was also the right time for the adaptation to be done, where practical effects in cinema had just kind of been perfected, and digital was being introduced and utilized well enough to touch up certain elements to make The Lord of the Rings be the visual marvel that it largely holds up to still be today. Yes, there are still those weird overlappy face shots, and then there's floating Gandalf, and those don't look perfect, but overall on average, magnificent. Now, in addition to all of that, there was also a studio behind the project, Miramax, which was willing to take a gargantuan financial risk in not only giving the project enough money to make each movie look spectacular, but then also allowing Peter Jackson to film all 3 back to back, just gambling that each one would be a financial success. One quick correction brought on by me remembering what studio logos I see before watching Fellowship of the Ring, and that would actually be New Line Cinema and not Miramax. And that is because, after looking into it, yes, Miramax did at first get production going, but they then got cold feet when they realized just how much was going to be required to get it done. Then they passed it on off to New Line Cinema. With a combined budget for all 3 Lord of the Rings movies of nearly $300 million, New Line was taking a gargantuan financial risk here, especially with allowing a relatively unknown Peter Jackson to film all 3 movies back to back to back, which was seen a little bit as a cost-saving measure, but also meant, yes, this was an all-in gamble. I still don't know, with my jaded negative view of Hollywood, how this was greenlight to be what it turned out to be. You have Peter Jackson, who is a massive fan and a very talented director, but relatively unproven, managing to land a ridiculously talented cast of mostly unknowns at the time, and working with the best people in the business in terms of VFX and just practical works in the most beautiful part of the world, debatably, to truly make the viewer feel like they were in Middle-earth. I do not think any fantasy adaptation will ever have the number of stars aligned just right to be this universally loved ever again. I just don't see it happening in my lifetime. Combine that with Howard Shore's score, what could you even do to make it better? Fortunately though, for New Line, Peter Jackson, the whole cast, and the Tolkien estate, even though they've kind of been negative on these movies, this was not only the critical success we saw talking about with 11 Oscars for Return of the King, but also a financial hit. While they risked $300 million in funding these projects, they brought in a combined $3 billion just in their worldwide theatrical run. I want to emphasize that. That does not include the boost of sales to books from the movies coming out, toys, video games, all of those things which absolutely still continue to benefit from this day from the success of Jackson's trilogy. Now, in the irony of all ironies, Jackson was asked to come back and make 3 more movies. Now, he was not asked to make 3 movies at first, he was just asked to adapt The Hobbit. But as things moved along and studio involvement got heavier and heavier, The Hobbit was split into more and more films. to the point where we have 3. And whereas before, Lord of the Rings adaptations started falling apart and not working because it tried to over-condense, the Hobbit movies by Peter Jackson are largely criticized for feeling extremely bloated and like they are unnecessarily inflating their runtime just to be able to have a higher financial return. These criticisms are not wrong. And I think the #1 indicator you can look at how this was a significant step down, at least in how it was received by audiences, while each of the Lord of the Rings trilogy went up in the amount of money it made at the box office while in theaters, The Hobbit did the inverse. But it is important to note, they were all 3 still seen as financial successes, especially once you tie in all the multimedia ways they are able to benefit, like merchandising. Thank you, Star Wars, for starting that trend, I guess. There's a whole other video to be made about how Star Wars, yes, makes money at the box office, but it makes way more money in the toy aisle. But alright, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't get the dates out of the way. We had The Fellowship of the Ring released in 2001, The Two Towers released in 2002, Return of the King was released in 2003, and then 9 years later we had the first Hobbit movie with An Unexpected Journey released in 2012. The Desolation of Smaug followed that up next year in 2013, and The Battle of the Five Armies was released in 2014. And the final thing I will say about the Hobbit movies here is it's fine to be a fan of them, though I'm going to acknowledge the fact that yes, Jackson himself has criticized these movies, and several of the actors involved have come out with problems with the production as well, including Ian McKellen really hating working with green screens to the extent that he did, and Evangeline Lilly having quite the axe to grind about a forced-in romance plotline that she actually was told would not be there when she took the part. That sucks. Now, there's one more big old live-action adaptation to talk about when it comes to Lord of the Rings, and that would be The Rings of Power. Bah! Rings of Power, though, for me, is kind of like the scentless fart of the adaptation legacy of the Middle-earth franchise. It's not as offensive as it could be, and there are certainly some people who even enjoy that. And I find some elements of it that I enjoy. I'm not backing this metaphor anymore. But it's safe to say at this point that the Rings of Power is going to be viewed in the legacy of Middle-earth as a step down from even the Hobbit movies. It's absolutely great to be a fan of it, I'm a bit jealous if you are, but this has been received by the Tolkien fandom and the wider just sci-fi fantasy fandom as not the best representation of Tolkien's material, largely due to how much they're trying to do with how little rights they have, and some just shockingly bland writing. Now, I'd be remiss if I did not talk about the one upcoming project that is planned to be animated titled War of the Rohirrim, being brought to us by New Line at some point in 2024. But that just about does it when it comes to adaptations of The Lord of the Rings. It is, without a doubt, the most important fantasy series we have covered here on The Breakdown, and I took a little bit of a different approach to it because of that. It was such an intimidating task to take on because it is the fantasy series that I can pretty much find a reason to reference when talking about any other sci-fi fantasy series. To finish off this video, I tried to do research into just how much money the Lord of the Rings Middle-earth franchise has made as a whole, and this number on that franchise list you can find just by putting in most profitable franchises, I highly doubt is accurate. Because one, it's accounting for essentially just box office results, when books, toys, things like that for Middle-earth, you better bet your ass are going to be major contributing factors. So unfortunately, I can't really deliver a solid number to you, though I would guess it's going to be easily in the 10 to 15 to $20 billion range. That is a very ballpark guess, obviously, after doing as much research as I could. But ending the video on the note I think it deserves, Tolkien managed to change literature when he released The Hobbit, but somehow he was imaginative and talented enough to follow it up not once, not twice, but 3, 4 times if you count the Silmarillion, which I do, and that is something I'm truly grateful for. Even if you count it in a different way with Lord of the Rings just being 1, it is still 3, because Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, Silmarillion. Debate that in the comments down below. How would you count it? Do you go with the Tolkien count or the publisher count? Thank you everyone for tuning in so much and being a part of this breakdown. Like and subscribe if you have not already, and hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here.